If you've ever tried to print with transparent filament, you know how hard it is to get that non-cloudy, actual transparent look and feel. In this video, I will go over exactly how I went from getting not transparent results at all in my 3D prints to getting very transparent results. And don't just believe me, people who bought this product from me have actually really loved how transparent this looks compared to anything that's on the market. It has taken me months to get to these exact print settings to get as transparent as you can get with a 3D printer. I want to be upfront transparent though.
No pun intended.
You're never gonna get the actual transparency of a glass or an acrylic block that was milled out to get the exact shape of a print that you wanted. With a 3D printer, you're always gonna have those layer lines, so it's not gonna be fully transparent, but this will get you as close to transparent for, let's say, a prototype that you're working on and you just want to test it out before you actually send it to a factory to manufacture, or you're just a hobbyist like me and you want to print stuff with transparency so it doesn't look as gross as those cloudy prints look, and actually dial in your settings. The number one and the simplest thing I can tell you is dry your filament. Now, you may have heard from other people that you need to dry your filament is very important, but when I was researching about this, I actually did not understand why do I need to dry my filament. When your PETG filament is sitting out for a while, what happens is a lot of moisture from your environment seeps into the filament, and you will never see that moisture actually build up on your filament with your naked eyes. But when you go to print, when it's putting down those layers, because the nozzle is so hot and it evaporates water, as soon as it comes out of the nozzle, there's these micro water vapors that are evaporated but then get embedded inside the layers that you're printing. So then you'll see these like white little bubbles that are irregularities in your print. And for the longest time, I thought that this was just because my filament was bad, or my print settings were not good, or my printer was just very irregular. But once I actually dried the filament, the difference between a fully dried filament and a non-fully dried filament with the exact same print settings was massive. I stopped having those little micro vapor bubbles. All of that was just gone. So number one thing is drying your filament. Now for me, I have this Creality drying box that I use for literally all of my prints when I need to use a filament that I have used before and it's been open for more than a week. I usually just put it inside the box and have a PTFE tube that goes from the dryer straight to the printer, so I can have both of my printers printing with filament that is dry and can constantly be dried as it's printing for the most optimal print quality. And anything that I mentioned in this video, I will link that in the description below so you can check it out yourself. Okay, now on to the second thing, the layer alignments. Now when you're printing, if you just use general settings, what you'll see is your printer goes in a crisp and cross direction. So if you just use default settings on a printer, it prints things really well and they end up being very strong even if you have like a 1mm or 2mm thin layer. And that way your walls and your inner layers are strong enough so you can just like pierce through them and your print comes out really strong. And that's why you'll see that your infill at 15% is the default. But when you're doing a transparent filament, you have to make sure that all of the lines are in one angle. So it's gotta be 0 degrees. It cannot have a criss-cross pattern. It cannot have a plus pattern. It has to be fully aligned. So when light travels through and you wanna see what object is right behind it, those layers have to be in the exact same line so that light can pass through them, instead of if it was like criss and cross, the light would not go through them and that would create like that cloudy feeling that you see in a lot of 3D prints. And even in your infill, either you gotta go 0% infill or you just gotta have these walls that are super thin that don't even need any infill. And that brings me to point number 3. The aligned layers on the walls and the base can cause it to be not as strong as a crisscross pattern. And the solution I found for myself was, for this design specifically, the biggest layer is this back layer, and the thickness of this is only about 1.25mm. So it's strong enough that even if I do this, it doesn't just break, but it's thin enough that you can see what's behind it pretty clearly. But if you're printing that on a flat layer, that's gonna cause issues. The only reason this ends up being really strong is because these walls at the end are 1.5mm, and that gives it that rigid feeling. So it's not like as fragile as if it was just 1.25mm with just aligned layers. Rather, this gives it that rigid feel because these lines end up being thicker, and PETG is relatively strong. So even if I do this, it doesn't just come off. So you just have to know what your design is and what trade-offs you are willing to make it strong enough, but also transparent enough. Okay, now number 4, the cooling temperature and printing speeds. Now, when you're putting these layers down, they have to be so accurate that they stack on top of each other without having any irregularities. And they just gotta stack on top of each other, and these are very thin lines. And it's gotta go slow enough so when it's putting those layers down, it doesn't have that much speed that it could have even the most minor irregularities, but it can't be too slow that the filament just burns and leaves those like burnt filament marks as it's printing because it's so slow and has such a long time of contact with the filament that burns it. And I'll show you all of the settings that I have for my specific filament and print that I do, and you can take that maybe as like a baseline and adjust your settings as you print your thing. So the least amount of layer lines that you can stack on top of each other with not a lot of fan speed, slow printing speeds, and hot enough filament will help you get that transparent look on a 3D print. Now, of course, the downside of that is your prints are going to be very, very slow and take a very long time, but that's kind of the trade-off you have to make to get really good transparent looking prints. For reference, printing one of these by itself with like a solid color filament takes about like an hour and 50 minutes, hour and 40 minutes. But printing this with a transparent filament takes about 4.5 hours. So that's way more than double. Okay, now point number 5. The orientations matter. Now when I print this, I tested a lot of different ways to print this in which orientation. Should I print it upright, flat, on its side, or like on the back, which would use the least amount of filament, give me high speeds, and also give me the most amount of transparency like I want. So you may think if I just print it this way, where the base is right here, so it will have the least amount of layer lines printing this way, and it'll just print the corners and get it up. That may sound like the perfect idea, but the issue with a design like this is, oh, it's so smooth on the sides that I dropped it. That's where I was gonna get to, is if I print it like this, oh my god.
Are you serious right now, bro?
Back to this, because it has these curves, 3D prints go in a layer line, so it would create these like rough edges on this corner even with supports, and when you're holding it like this, it would, for a customer, it would cause those like rough edges, and you really don't want that on a product that you're gonna hold all the time. Maybe if you're printing something else that just needs to stay on a shelf and that needs to be transparent, that could work. I mean, if you're not touching it that much. But this standing upright, where the printer goes this way, it deposits those layers in a specific orientation and goes up. So it gets those alignments, gets the walls correctly, and there are literally no rough edges and gets them really smooth like it was machined. And the only post-processing then I have to do is at the very base of this, when it prints like this, it gets these corners a little rough, and these corners are gonna be at the very top that almost no one really touches. And I can take a 600 grit sandpaper and I can just sandpaper it under running water, and it gets all of those rough edges out, and it works perfectly fine. And point number 6, supports, supports, supports. Let's say I have this case and I print it this way. What would happen is it would create a lot of supports in between right here to get this last layer all flat. And when I would take the supports off, because the supports need to be touching that top layer, and that's why they are supports. Once you remove those supports, because they were touching this top layer, it would leave so many rough edges on these corners that it would not look as transparent as this looks right now. So you really gotta plan your orientation of your print, where you're gonna print it, how you're gonna print it. You wanna make sure you don't get the rough edges, and the supports need to be in a place where it's never going to be touched or is not on that big surface that you wanna be seeing through, because it's gonna leave those rough edges. And I tested like every orientation you could possibly think of with different settings, and the best one I could land on was if I print it this way. The supports are organic, so they are on the build plate, they come up and they only touch this inside, and a customer's never touching the inside of this case. It's always pretty much on the outside. So I can just remove those supports, and you're never really like looking through from the bottom. Even if you do, it looks fine. It actually doesn't look too bad, but it's not as transparent. If I had the big base layer with all the supports and all the rough edges, that would have looked like not clean at all. And that's another trade-off you just gotta make. And on this side works perfectly on that. So be very intentional what orientation you print this in, and where and what kind of supports do you like. I like the organic supports because they go on the build plate and they don't like attach at the bottom on any part of the print, and that is very easy to remove. Okay, now let's do a PrusaSlicer walkthrough, and I'll show you exactly the settings that I have for this print right here. And this is all open source. You can actually download the print file for this and just print it yourself. But if you want to see the exact settings that I changed, here you go. Okay, let's go through layer and parameters. The first layer, I do it pretty thin, so it sticks really well. And then the subsequent layer lines are 0.2. I didn't want to make it too thin, because if you do like 0.1, it doesn't actually yield better results. I've tried it before. It just increases your time of the print. It goes from 3 3.5 hours or 6.5 hours, so it just doesn't make any sense. Okay, solid layers, you don't want to do zeros, because if you don't remove the solid layers from top and bottom, it will create that zigzag pattern, and you actually don't want that. And we solve that in our infill, where specifically for the infill, you have to do 100% align rectilinear, so it gets all of the infill in one direction. Length of the infill 0, and then top infill pattern, that just ends up being aligned rectilinear because that's what we're trying to do here. And the fill angle has to be 0. And then for support material, I do organic, support on build plate only, and then the top Z contact is 0.25, so it's easier to take off, but still it's snug enough so it doesn't leave any like irregularity. And speed is where all of it lies into. Getting good like layer qualities, I have it down everything to 45. By default, this ends up being like 70 and 50, but 45 for perimeters, external perimeters being 15, like outside layers being really slow, where I got really good results. And then for the filaments, I increased the default temperature to be much higher than the default PETG. It was 250, but I had to do it 260, so it gets even hotter. And the first layer to be much hotter on the bed, so it adheres and doesn't like come off. And for cooling, the maximum speed that I can allow it is 10%, and that only happens after the first 4 layers are printed, so they are put down, and then the fan kicks in, but only goes up to 10%. By default, it can cool really fast, like 60%, but then that would create those bubbles and a lot of that cloudy looking print, and you don't want that. So in closing, if you think this is too much of a hassle, just print with solid colors. Do not print with transparent filament, because if you just use the default settings on a transparent filament, it looks way worse than if you just took a solid like black or white or blue color. It would look much better than doing a transparent filament and not dialing in the settings. So with the right dried filament and perfect orientation, where your supports go, and the layer thickness, you can actually get a really good result on how your print should look like at the end and get a really transparent look like I have it here. If you have any suggestions on how you may have gotten your print to be more transparent than this, I am all ears. Please let me know in the comments. I would love to make a follow-up video on improving even this print to be more transparent. I think that would help so many people who want to print something very transparent but can't get the settings right. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of y'all, and until next time, thank you for watching.